You clearly don't belong here." The words cut through the crystal-clear air of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom like a blade through silk. Madison Blake, CEO of Technova Industries, stood in her designer gown worth more than most people's cars, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed in an elaborate updo that had taken 3 hours to perfect. Her blue eyes, cold as winter steel and just as unforgiving, looked down at the woman before her with the kind of disdain typically reserved for something distasteful found on the bottom of one's designer shoe. Danielle Carter stood motionless in the center of what had become an impromptu arena, her dark skin radiant and luminous against the simple black evening dress she wore. Elegant, understated, expensive in its very simplicity, but carrying none of the ostentatious displays of wealth that marked the other guests. Around them, the cream of New York's billionaire society continued their conversations in hushed, excited tones, champagne glasses clinking like wind chimes in an expensive breeze, laughter echoing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. But the immediate circle had fallen into the kind of silence that preceded either triumph or catastrophe. Eyes watched with predatory hunger. Phones discreetly angled to capture what promised to be a moment of social devastation. The kind of moment that could define careers, destroy reputations, change the entire trajectory of lives with the brutal efficiency of a guillotine blade. Danielle's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of embarrassment, not of the fear that Madison Blake so clearly expected to see, but something far more dangerous, far more controlled. A smile that spoke of secrets held, of cards not yet played, of power that ran deeper than designer gowns and inherited wealth. She knew something Madison Blake did not, something that would transform this glittering evening from a celebration of elite privilege into a nightmare the tech CEO would carry with her for the rest of her dramatically shortened career. You won't believe what's about to unfold when the masks finally come off. 2 hours earlier, as Manhattan's golden hour cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue, Danielle had walked through the plaza's revolving doors with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere, all at once. She moved through the opulent lobby like water, fluid and unstoppable, her presence both commanding and humble, in a way that confused the usual social hierarchies these events depended upon. The contrast was striking and deliberate, while other guests swept in with entourages of assistants and bodyguards, dripping in diamonds that caught the light like captured stars, and making declarations of their importance to anyone within earshot. Danielle arrived alone, unannounced, unadorned save for a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The first signs of what was to come were subtle, woven into the fabric of the evening with the practiced invisibility of institutional discrimination. A waiter in pristine white gloves glanced past her extended hand reaching for champagne, serving the white woman beside her first with an elaborate flourish, then the man beyond her with deferential attention, before reluctantly offering Danielle the last glass on his silver tray as an obvious afterthought. The sommelier, a pretentious man with a French accent that sounded suspiciously manufactured, spent 15 minutes explaining wine selections to every table in his section except hers, somehow finding urgent business elsewhere whenever she attempted to make eye contact. The photographer, hired specifically to capture New York's power players for society magazines, seemed to develop a fascinating ability to find every angle in the ballroom except the one that would include Danielle in the group shots. She watched him contort himself into increasingly awkward positions to avoid including her in frames with the other guests, his lens finding elaborate ways to crop her out of what would become tomorrow's see and be seen spreads. Danielle noticed it all with the practiced eye of someone who had been reading the invisible language of exclusion since childhood. She always did. 43 years of life had taught her to recognize the microaggressions that whispered "other" in spaces like this. the subtle ways power protected itself through 1,000 small acts of dismissal and disregard. But tonight, she observed with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens under a microscope, cataloguing behavior patterns that would soon become evidence in a much larger case study. From her position near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, where the autumn leaves caught the last light of day like nature's own fireworks display, she watched Madison Blake hold court near the silent auction tables. Madison commanded attention with the effortless grace of someone born to it. Blonde, beautiful, brilliant, they said. The kind of woman who graced magazine covers with headlines about Tech's new queens and the future is female. She was surrounded by a constellation of admirers, each one orbiting around her particular brand of sharp-tongued charisma. Hedge fund managers who moved billions with a phone call, real estate moguls who owned skylines, politicians who shaped policies, all of them drawn to her magnetic combination of beauty, brains, and barely contained cruelty. When Madison's eyes first landed on Danielle across the crowded ballroom, the reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable. A flicker of confusion crossed her perfectly sculpted features, followed by rapid-fire assessment, then swift dismissal. Madison's gaze traveled from Danielle's modest jewelry to her understated dress to her position alone by the window, and Danielle could practically see the calculation happening behind those ice-blue eyes. Not one of us. Doesn't compute. Error in the system. The room buzzed with the intoxicating energy of people who moved markets with whispered conversations, toppled governments with strategic donations, built empires from nothing more than ambition and the ability to make others believe in their vision. But as Danielle stood there, observing, cataloguing, preparing, she felt the familiar weight of being the only one. The only black face in a sea of white power and privilege. The only woman standing alone while others networked in tight clusters of mutual advancement. The only person in the room who didn't seem to belong to their exclusive club of inherited wealth and manufactured importance. But appearances, as Danielle had learned through decades of strategic patience, could be devastatingly deceiving. Sometimes the most dangerous predator in the room was the one that looked like prey. Madison's approach was calculated and predatory, executed with the precision of someone who had spent her entire life using social dynamics as weapons. She glided across the marble floor with the liquid confidence of someone who had never been told no and never expected to be, her designer heels clicking out a rhythm of entitled authority. Her entourage followed in formation like a pack of wolves who had caught the scent of vulnerable prey. Richard Sterling, the real estate magnate whose hands were stained by decades of discriminatory housing practices that had systematically excluded families like Danielle's from prime Manhattan properties. Jessica Hartwell, whose old money family fortune was built on industries that had grown fat on the systematic exclusion of people who looked like Danielle. And Marcus Webb, whose venture capital firm had a notable and carefully maintained absence of diversity in their investment portfolio. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting." Madison's voice carried the kind of crystalline authority that expected immediate deference, each word perfectly enunciated and weighted with the assumption of superiority. "I'm Madison Blake, CEO and founder of Technova Industries. And you are?" The question hung in the air with deliberately theatrical suspense, designed to put Danielle on the defensive, to force her into the position of having to justify her existence in their rarefied space. "Danielle Carter." The response was simple, direct, unadorned by titles or explanations or the kind of elaborate credentials dropping that typically marked introductions in circles like this. Madison waited for more, a smile growing slightly strained as the expected flood of qualifying information failed to materialize. When it didn't come, her perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the tightening around her eyes, the first crack in her polished facade. "And what brings you to our little gathering tonight, Danielle?" The pronoun choice was deliberate and cutting, a verbal construction of ownership that divided the room into insiders and outsiders with surgical precision. Our gathering, our space, our rules. Danielle had heard variations of this exclusionary language 1,000 times before in 1,000 different contexts, from country club dining rooms to corporate boardrooms to academic conferences where her presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. "I was invited," Danielle replied, her voice steady and warm, carrying none of the defensive edge that Madison was clearly fishing for. "Oh, how wonderful." Jessica Hartwell chimed in with the kind of performative enthusiasm that barely masked genuine suspicion. "And who do you work for? What company? I'm sure we'd love to hear about your professional background." The pause before professional background was loaded with implications, suggesting that perhaps Danielle's background was something other than professional, something less legitimate, something that required explanation and justification. "I work in business development." The answer was deliberately vague, designed to reveal nothing while satisfying the basic requirements of social interaction. "How interesting." Madison's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal, sharp and dangerous. Business development is such a broad field, isn't it? Business development for whom, exactly? What sector? What kind of scope? Surely someone in your position would be more specific about their credentials and achievements. The circle was tightening now, both literally and figuratively. Other guests, drawn by the unmistakable scent of social blood in the water and the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense, began to drift closer with the casual curiosity of spectators gathering around a car accident. Conversations at nearby tables quieted as people strained to listen. The ambient noise of the party seemed to dim around their little group, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. "I work across multiple sectors," Danielle said, her tone remaining maddeningly calm and unruffled. "Primarily focused on growth opportunities and strategic partnerships." Richard Sterling stepped forward, his expensive cologne creating an oppressive cloud around them, his presence designed to intimidate through sheer physical bulk and the weight of generational wealth. "That's quite interesting. Quite vague, really. Most people here tonight represent specific companies, specific achievements, specific contributions to New York's business landscape. The invitation list was very carefully curated, very exclusive, very selective. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun. Questions of legitimacy, questions of belonging, questions of whether Danielle had somehow slipped through the cracks of their carefully constructed barrier system. Danielle felt the weight of dozens of eyes now, the subtle shift in the room's energy, as phones began to discreetly angle their way, social media sensors tingling with the possibility of content, of drama, of the kind of moment that could go viral and define careers. She recognized the moment for what it was, the precipice before the fall, the quiet before the storm, the final seconds before the execution. But she also recognized something else, something that filled her with a cold satisfaction that her enemies couldn't see. The intoxicating hubris of people who believed themselves untouchable, who had never learned that power came in forms they couldn't recognize, couldn't quantify, couldn't control, couldn't defend against. "I'm sure the selection process was very thorough," Danielle replied, and took a deliberate sip of her champagne, the gesture carrying more menace than any threat could have. Madison's carefully maintained mask of polite society interest slipped completely now, revealing the cold, calculating predator that lurked beneath the polished surface of her public persona. The crowd had grown substantially larger, sensing drama with the predatory instinct of apex social hunters who lived for moments when someone could be publicly destroyed for their entertainment. Phones were no longer discreet. This was content. This was entertainment. This was the kind of moment that would be dissected frame by frame on social media platforms for weeks to come. "I think there's been some kind of serious mistake here," Madison announced, her voice carrying clearly across the surrounding silence with the authority of someone used to commanding attention and obedience. "This event is specifically designed for individuals who have made substantial, documented contributions to New York's business community. People with verified achievements, proven track records, established credentials." The words were carefully chosen and precisely delivered, each one a stiletto thrust wrapped in the veneer of reasonable concern for propriety and security. Danielle could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way conversation stopped completely now throughout the entire ballroom, the way even the waiters had paused in their service to watch the unfolding drama. The invitation and vetting process was extraordinarily thorough, Madison continued, warming to a theme with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Background checks, financial verification, contribution minimums, portfolio reviews, reputation assessments. We simply cannot have irregularities or misunderstandings at an event of this caliber and importance. Richard Sterling nodded with grave authority, his expression carrying the weight of someone whose family had been excluding the wrong sort of people from important gatherings for generations. Madison's absolutely correct. The integrity and security of these gatherings depends entirely on maintaining certain standards, certain qualifications. Jessica Hartwell adopted an expression of genuine concern, the kind of performative worry that would play beautifully on camera and provide perfect cover for the cruelty that was about to unfold. Perhaps there was some confusion with the catering staff, or event planning coordination. Sometimes these mix-ups happen when there are so many different service providers involved in an event of this scale. The implications were clear, devastating, and utterly intentional. Not a guest, not an equal, not someone who belonged in their rarefied atmosphere. An interloper, a mistake, a service provider who had somehow confused herself with the people she was supposed to be serving. Someone who cleaned up after the real players rather than being one herself. Marcus Webb, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty to the pack, stepped forward with the eager cruelty of someone seeking approval from more powerful predators. "Security really should verify everyone's credentials. We can't be too careful about who has access to these kinds of sensitive environments." The crowd murmured agreement, a low rumble of shared superiority and collective othering that had been perfected in exclusive clubs and private schools across generations of American elite society. The energy was becoming dangerous now, mob-like, the kind of group dynamic that could destroy lives in minutes and leave the perpetrators feeling righteous about their actions. Danielle stood perfectly still through it all, her posture erect and unshakable, her expression serene as a Renaissance painting of a saint facing martyrdom. Inside, she felt the familiar burn of rage. Not the hot, destructive kind that would give them exactly the reaction they expected and wanted, but the cold, surgical kind that could cut through lies and pretense and privilege like a laser through tissue paper. She reached into her small evening bag with movements that were smooth, unhurried, deliberately methodical. The entire crowd watched as she withdrew her phone, the simple action somehow carrying more weight and meaning than any words could have conveyed. She typed a brief message with the calm precision of someone dispatching a death warrant. "Initiate Plan B. Cancel all funding commitments immediately. Effective now. Full withdrawal." Then she put the phone away with the same deliberate care and looked directly at Madison Blake with eyes that held depths these people couldn't begin to fathom. "These vetting processes do seem rather targeted," Danielle said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that none of them were intelligent enough to heed. "Almost as if they're specifically designed to exclude certain types of people certain backgrounds, certain demographics. But I suppose that's exactly the point, isn't it? The smile that crossed her lips was the smile of someone holding cards that no one else at the table could see. Someone who had been playing a completely different game while her opponents thought they were winning at checkers. I wonder, she continued with deadly softness, if any of you have the slightest idea who you're really dealing with tonight. The confrontation escalated with the methodical precision of a choreographed dance of destruction, each movement calculated to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of civilized discourse. Madison Blake, sensing blood in the water and emboldened by the crowd's apparent support and the intoxicating rush of public dominance, decided it was time to go for the kill with the ruthless efficiency that had made her famous in Silicon Valley's most cutthroat circles. "Security!" Madison called out, her voice cutting across the ballroom with imperial authority that brooked no argument or hesitation. "I think we need to verify this woman's invitation and credentials immediately. There seems to be some serious confusion about her right to be here, and frankly, her presence is making our legitimate guests uncomfortable." A security guard approached with obvious reluctance, his professional training warring with his discomfort at the public nature of the confrontation and the racial undertones that were becoming impossible to ignore. The crowd pressed closer with predatory excitement, phones recording every moment from multiple angles, social media posts already going live with hashtags like Plazagate and Galagate and Our Security Breach trending in real time across platforms. Danielle remained motionless, her hands folded calmly in front of her with the serene composure of someone who had faced down far more dangerous opponents than a pack of overprivileged socialites. "I don't believe I need to prove anything to anyone here," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd with quiet authority. "Oh, but you absolutely do." Madison's smile was razor-sharp now, glittering with malicious pleasure as she prepared to deliver what she believed would be the killing blow. "You see, this isn't just any social event or casual gathering. This is a carefully curated assembly of New York's business elite, people who've earned their place through documented achievement, through measurable contribution, through proven merit and established success." The racist undertones were becoming increasingly obvious now, though still wrapped in the kind of coded language that would allow for plausible deniability in later damage control efforts. Danielle recognized the tactic with grim familiarity. The systematic othering, the gradual escalation of hostility disguised as reasonable concern for standards and security and maintaining quality. Richard Sterling joined the chorus with the practiced ease of someone who had been perfecting these techniques for decades. Madison's absolutely right about this. The integrity and exclusivity of these events depends entirely on maintaining proper protocols and security measures. We simply cannot have imposters or uninvited individuals mingling with legitimate business leaders and potentially gathering sensitive information. Imposters. The word hung in the air like a poison cloud, its implications spreading through the crowd with viral intensity. Jessica Hartwell nodded with sage authority, her expression carefully crafted to convey reasonable concern while masking the cruel entertainment she was deriving from the situation. "It's really for everyone's protection and peace of mind. Imagine if someone were here under false pretenses, potentially recording confidential conversations, gathering competitive intelligence, taking advantage of the trust and openness we maintain in these exclusive environments." The accusations were multiplying now like cancer cells, each one more outrageous and damaging than the last. Danielle was no longer just an unwelcome guest. She was a potential corporate spy, a fraud, a security threat, a dangerous interloper who posed an existential threat to their sacred circle of privilege and power. Marcus Webb, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his pack loyalty and climb higher in the social hierarchy, stepped forward with the eager cruelty of a hyena joining a kill. I think we should involve hotel security and possibly even law enforcement. We can't be too careful about protecting our community from these kinds of infiltrations. The crowd had grown to encompass nearly half the ballroom now, conversations stopping entirely as the drama reached its crescendo. Even the orchestra had noticed the commotion and reduced their volume to avoid competing with the unfolding spectacle. The energy in the room was electric and dangerous, the kind of mob mentality that could destroy lives in minutes while leaving the perpetrators feeling righteous and justified about their collective cruelty. Madison raised her voice to address the gathering crowd directly, playing to her audience with the skill of a seasoned performer who understood exactly how to manipulate group dynamics for maximum impact. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate disruption to our evening. It appears we have experienced a serious security breach tonight. Someone who clearly doesn't belong in our community. Someone who may have obtained access through fraudulent means or deliberate deception. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like waves on a poisoned shore, each voice adding to the chorus of collective superiority and shared exclusion. Phones flashed continuously now, videos uploading in real time to social media platforms where the story was already writing itself with predictable narratives. Security breach at exclusive Plaza Gala, fraud exposed at Manhattan's most elite event, imposter crashes Billionaire's ball. Through it all, Danielle stood with the calm dignity of someone who had weathered far worse storms than this pack of overfed predators could possibly imagine. She watched Madison Blake orchestrate her own destruction with the detached fascination of an entomologist studying a particularly venomous but ultimately doomed species of insect, knowing that every word, every gesture, every cruel assumption was being recorded for posterity. Because Danielle knew something that Madison Blake, in all her privileged arrogance and carefully cultivated ignorance, could never have imagined in her most paranoid nightmares. The real power in this room didn't belong to the people making the most noise, demanding the most attention, claiming the most authority. It belonged to the woman they were so desperately trying to silence, and she was about to remind them exactly what power looked like when it finally decided to speak. The moment of revelation came, not with thunder and lightning, but with the gentle, almost musical chime of multiple phones receiving priority notifications simultaneously across the ballroom. The sound rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into perfectly still water, creating expanding circles of confusion and growing alarm as the mob's bloodthirsty attention began to shift and fracture. Every event organizer, every board member, every major sponsor and influential donor in the room felt their devices buzz with the kind of urgent, high-priority alert typically reserved for catastrophic news or market-moving events. The notifications came in waves: emails, text messages, app alerts, emergency communications from assistance and crisis management teams, each one carrying the same devastating message. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the event's distinguished chairwoman and a woman whose reputation for grace under pressure had been built over 3 decades of managing New York's most exclusive charitable initiatives, pushed through the crowd with the desperate urgency of someone whose entire career was hanging by a thread that was rapidly fraying. Her face had gone ashen as she read the cascading messages on her screen, and her eyes sought out Danielle with growing horror and the dawning realization that a catastrophic mistake had been made. Ms. Carter. Dr. Morrison's voice cracked with stress and barely controlled panic as she approached, her usual professional composure completely shattered. There's been a terrible, inexcusable misunderstanding here tonight. The crowd fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Confused, uncertain, charged with the electricity of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. The mob mentality was fracturing as people began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the room's power dynamics, that the prey they had been circling might not be what it appeared to be. Madison Blake, still riding high on her moment of triumph and the intoxicating rush of public domination, looked genuinely annoyed at the interruption to her carefully orchestrated performance. "Patricia, we're handling a security situation here that requires immediate attention. This woman has clearly— This woman—" Dr. Morrison interrupted with growing strength in her voice, the words carrying across the silent ballroom with the force of a revelation, "is Danielle Carter, CEO and founder of Carter Global Foundation, the primary sponsor and largest single donor in tonight's event." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the massive ballroom. 100 conversations died simultaneously. Phones that had been recording Madison's persecution now swung toward Danielle with desperate hunger for her reaction, for some sign of how this impossible reversal could be true. Danielle straightened slightly, and for the first time that evening, she allowed her full presence to fill the space around her, without the deliberate humility that had masked her true nature. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The humble observer became the commanding executive. The outsider revealed herself as the ultimate insider. The supposed victim emerged as the person who controlled everything they thought they understood about power. "Ms. Carter's foundation," Dr. Morrison continued, her voice now carrying clearly across the silent ballroom with the authority of someone delivering news that would reshape careers and reputations, committed $4.9 billion to tonight's charitable initiatives and long-term program funding, the largest single donation in our organization's 50-year history. Madison Blake's face went white, then gray, then a sickly green that had nothing to do with the ballroom's elegant lighting and everything to do with the crushing realization that she had just orchestrated her own professional suicide in front of hundreds of witnesses and thousands of social media followers. However, Dr. Morrison's voice cracked again with the weight of delivering catastrophic news. "We've just received formal notification that Carter Global Foundation is withdrawing their entire commitment and all associated funding, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with implications that would ripple through New York's charitable and business communities for years to come. In that moment, the financial devastation crashed over the crowd like a tsunami of consequences. Entire charitable organizations would fold overnight. Critical social programs would die on the vine. Medical research initiatives would lose their funding. Educational scholarships would disappear. The ripple effects would be felt in boardrooms and non-profit offices across the globe. Danielle stepped forward slightly, and the crowd parted before her, like the Red Sea parting before Moses, each person instinctively recognizing the presence of real power when it finally chose to reveal itself. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who moved billions of dollars with a whisper and reshaped industries with a phone call. "I am indeed Danielle Carter," she said, her words cutting through the silence like silk through paper, each syllable weighted with the kind of authority that couldn't be inherited or purchased. "And I had very much looked forward to supporting tonight's causes and continuing our foundation's partnership with these important charitable initiatives." She paused, allowing the weight of lost opportunity to settle over the crowd like a burial shroud. "Unfortunately, I've experienced a level of discrimination, hostility, and systematic prejudice tonight that makes it impossible for me to associate my foundation's name and reputation with this event or these organizations." She turned to look directly at Madison Blake, who stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her brain struggled to process the magnitude of her miscalculation. "You assumed I didn't belong here based on nothing more than the color of my skin and your own prejudices," Danielle continued with devastating calm. "You were catastrophically wrong. This event exists because I chose to fund it. These programs continue because I chose to support them. and now I'm choosing not to. The devastation was immediate, complete, and utterly irreversible. Madison Blake had just orchestrated the destruction of a $4.9 billion charitable initiative in front of hundreds of witnesses, recorded on dozens of phones, broadcast live to thousands of social media followers who were watching the most expensive mistake in philanthropic history unfold in real time. And as Danielle's smile grew slightly wider, everyone in the room understood that the night was far from over. The destruction of Madison Blake's carefully constructed life began before she even left the Plaza Hotel that night, unfolding with the inexorable force of an avalanche that grows more devastating with each passing second. Within the first hour, the videos had begun their viral spread across every social media platform, algorithm-driven recommendation engines pushing the content to millions of users hungry for justice, revenge, and the spectacular downfall of privilege. Danielle Carter Revealed became the #1 trending topic worldwide within 3 hours, accumulating over 50 million views before midnight. The hashtag Madison Blake Failed followed close behind, accompanied by increasingly creative variations that captured the public's fascination with watching power destroy itself through its own arrogance. The footage was absolutely devastating in its clarity and completeness. Madison's racism laid bare in high-definition video, her assumptions shattered in real time, her complete inability to recognize actual power when it stood quietly in front of her, wearing an understated black dress and pearls. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty was preserved forever in digital amber, ready to be replayed endlessly by a public hungry for accountability. By morning, Teknova Industries' stock had plummeted 37% in pre-market trading, wiping out over $2 billion in market capitalization as investors fled in panic. By noon, the board had called an emergency meeting that lasted 14 hours and ended with Madison Blake's unanimous removal from every position of authority in the company she had spent 15 years building. By evening, she was no longer CEO, no longer on the board, no longer welcome in the offices where her portrait had hung just that morning. The tech industry, despite its carefully cultivated reputation for disruption and innovation, remained remarkably traditional when it came to PR disasters of this magnitude and scope. Companies that had partnered with Teknova for years began distancing themselves with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. Major investors demanded emergency meetings and explanations. Enterprise clients cancelled multi-million-dollar contracts rather than risk association with the scandal. The domino effect was swift, merciless, and absolutely unstoppable. But the professional destruction was only the beginning of Madison's descent into personal and financial ruin. The Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into discriminatory practices at Teknova under Madison's leadership, subpoenaing records, interviewing employees, and building a case that would eventually result in one of the largest discrimination settlements in tech industry history. Employment lawyers emerged from the woodwork with stories from former employees, a carefully documented pattern of bias, exclusion, and systematic discrimination that had been hidden behind the veneer of Silicon Valley innovation and progressive rhetoric. The personal costs mounted with devastating speed. Madison's carefully cultivated personal brand, built over years of magazine covers, conference keynote speeches, and thought leadership articles, evaporated overnight like morning dew in desert heat. Speaking engagements worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were cancelled within hours. Board positions at prestigious non-profits and cultural institutions were revoked via terse emails. Book deals evaporated. Consulting contracts disappeared. The Manhattan apartment in Soho, the house in the Hamptons, the art collection that had been featured in Architectural Digest, all of it was liquidated piece by piece to pay mounting legal fees and settlement costs that grew larger each day. The Ferrari, the private jet shares, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobe, everything that had defined Madison Blake's identity and status disappeared into the hungry maw of consequences. The industry that had once celebrated her now treated her like a carrier of professional plague. Former friends stopped returning calls, their assistants delivering increasingly creative excuses for their unavailability. Networking events became minefields of awkward encounters and conversations that stopped mid-sentence when she entered the room. Even her coffee orders at exclusive Manhattan cafes were somehow always taking longer than usual. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter became the story that dominated news cycles for weeks, transforming from a victim of discrimination into a symbol of grace under pressure and strategic brilliance. The quiet dignity with which she had handled the confrontation, the devastating precision of her response, the masterful way she had allowed her tormentors to reveal their true nature before delivering perfect justice. It all combined to create a narrative that audiences couldn't get enough of. Interview requests poured in from every major network, every significant publication, every influential podcast host. When she finally agreed to appear on 60 Minutes, the segment broke viewing records and won 3 Emmy nominations, including one for the haunting final shot of Danielle sitting in her foundation's offices, surrounded by photos of the thousands of young entrepreneurs her programs had supported. "I didn't do this for revenge," Danielle told the interviewer, her voice steady and sure, carrying the weight of someone who understood that her actions would be studied and analyzed for years to come. "I did this because silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and complicity in the face of systematic discrimination is a form of violence against every person who has ever been told they don't belong." The interview became required viewing in business schools across the country, dissected in case studies about crisis management, leadership under pressure, and the true nature of power in modern society. Madison Blake, watching from her childhood bedroom in her parents' modest house in Columbus, Ohio, the same bedroom she had left 25 years earlier with dreams of conquering the world, turned off the television and wept for everything she had lost and everything she had never really understood about the world she thought she had mastered. 6 months later, Danielle Carter stood at the podium of the World Economic Forum in Davos, addressing an audience of global leaders, CEOs, politicians, and thought leaders who had gathered to hear from the woman whose response to discrimination had become a masterclass in strategic leadership and moral authority. The same woman who had once been dismissed as an interloper was now recognized as one of the most influential voices in international business, her foundation's work spanning 6 continents and affecting millions of lives. "Power!" she began, her voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium where every seat was filled and thousands more watched via live stream. "Is not what you possess in your bank account or your stock portfolio. It's not the title on your business card, or the size of your office, or the exclusivity of your social circle. Real power is what you choose to do with the resources and influence you've been given, how you use your position to lift others rather than to keep them down." The audience hung on every word, many of them having watched the Plaza Hotel videos countless times, having studied the masterclass in dignity and strategic response that Danielle had provided when faced with systematic discrimination and public humiliation. What happened that night at the Plaza was not unusual or extraordinary, she continued, her words carrying the weight of lived experience and careful analysis. It was simply unusual that it was recorded in high definition, that it went viral across social media platforms, that there were immediate and serious consequences for the perpetrators. Every single day, in boardrooms and conference rooms around the world, talented people are told they don't belong based on nothing more than bias and prejudice. She paused, allowing the words to settle into the consciousness of leaders who controlled trillions in resources and influenced billions of lives. Every day, human potential is dismissed because it doesn't fit someone's narrow, outdated definition of leadership or success. Every day, we lose innovations that could change the world, lose perspectives that could solve our greatest challenges, lose progress that could benefit all of humanity, simply because of assumptions and prejudices that have no place in a modern, interconnected economy. The Carter Global Foundation had committed over $100 billion to initiatives focused on educational equity, entrepreneurship development, and systematic bias elimination in institutions around the world. The impact was already being felt in universities from Harvard to Howard, in startup incubators from Silicon Valley to Lagos, in corporate boardrooms from Manhattan to Mumbai. Madison Blake was not uniquely evil or extraordinarily racist, Danielle continued, her words carrying a forgiveness that somehow made her moral authority even more powerful. She was simply the product of a system that taught her that worth was determined by appearance, that power was a zero-sum game where someone else's advancement meant her own diminishment, that exclusion was a virtue rather than a moral failure. The audience listened in complete silence, understanding that they were witnessing something rare, a person with the power to destroy, choosing instead to educate and elevate. The real tragedy is not just what happened to her that night, but what happened because of her attitudes and actions over the years. All the brilliant people who were never given chances to prove themselves, all the revolutionary ideas that were never heard because their creators were judged by their skin color rather than their potential, all the progress that was never made because gatekeepers confused their personal biases with professional standards. Danielle's foundation had established mentorship programs in over 40 countries, created scholarship opportunities for underrepresented entrepreneurs, and partnered with major corporations to redesign hiring and promotion practices that had systematically excluded talented individuals based on demographic characteristics rather than merit. We cannot change the past, Danielle concluded, her voice growing stronger as she reached the crescendo of her message. But we have the power to choose what kind of future we build together. We can choose to create systems that recognize and reward talent regardless of the package it comes in. We can choose to build opportunities based on merit rather than melanin, on character rather than connections, on potential rather than prejudice. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes and 43 seconds, with delegates from over 60 countries rising to their feet in recognition of leadership that transcended nationality, industry, and traditional power structures. Watching the live stream from her apartment in Columbus, Madison Blake, now working as a consultant for small businesses and slowly, painfully rebuilding her reputation through quiet acts of service and genuine transformation, found herself nodding along with tears in her eyes. It had taken losing everything she thought mattered to understand what Danielle Carter had known all along. True power was not about what you could take from others or the barriers you could build to protect your advantages. True power was about what you could give, what you could build, and how many people you could lift up along the way. The final image that would define the story and cement its place in the cultural consciousness came not from that transformative night at the plaza, not from the viral videos or the devastating interviews, but from a photograph taken at a small business incubator in Brooklyn 6 months later that would be shared millions of times across social media platforms. In the photograph, Danielle Carter sits across a conference table from a young black entrepreneur, reviewing business plans for a sustainable energy startup that would eventually revolutionize solar panel efficiency and create thousands of jobs. Both women are leaning forward, completely engaged, intensely focused, building something that didn't exist the day before and wouldn't exist without this moment of connection and investment. The caption reads simply, "Carter Global Foundation, funding the future, building tomorrow." But it's the smaller text at the bottom of the image that carries the real message, the one that would inspire countless others to step forward with their own ideas, their own dreams, their own determination to change the world. Last year, we were told we didn't belong. This year, we're building the rooms where everyone belongs. The story spread differently this time, not as outrage or entertainment or viral spectacle, but as inspiration, as proof that change was possible, that justice could be achieved, that power belonged in the hands of those who understood how to use it wisely and generously. Share after share, post after post, comment after comment, the message proliferated across digital networks with a simple but revolutionary premise. Everyone has the power to rewrite the rules if they're willing to stand up and act. The next time you see someone being treated unfairly, being dismissed because they don't fit someone's preconceived notions, being excluded from opportunities they've earned, Danielle's final interview quote had read, shared so many times it became a modern proverb. Remember this story. Stand up. Speak out. Create change. Every single one of us has more power than we realize to make the world more just, more inclusive, more fair. And then, with the slight smile that had become her trademark, the expression that had launched 1,000 memes and inspired 1,000,000 acts of courage. And remember, never underestimate who might be standing in front of you. You never know who's really holding the keys to the kingdom you think you control. The message resonated across social media platforms in ways that transcended demographics, geography, and traditional boundaries. It was shared by students facing discrimination in elite universities, by employees confronting bias in corporate environments, by entrepreneurs seeking funding in industries that had systematically excluded people who looked like them. It became a rallying cry, a source of strength, a reminder that power could shift in the space of a single conversation if someone was brave enough to use it. But beneath the viral spread and the inspirational messaging was something deeper and more fundamental. A recognition that the old systems were crumbling, that new leaders were rising from places the establishment had never thought to look, that power was shifting into the hands of those who understood that true strength came not from exclusion, but from inclusion, not from building walls, but from building bridges. True power whispers while injustice shouts. But when power finally decides to speak, the world has no choice but to listen. And the world was finally ready to hear the voices it had been silencing for far too long.